Oh, well, hello there. Welcome back to Introduction to Cultural Anthropology. Today we're going to be talking about culture. Oftentimes, culture is sort of this blanket term for a community, a group of people, right? Everything from large-scale nation states like the United States versus maybe just a few dozen people. So we're going to kind of talk about how cultures are developed, how we break them down as anthropologists to understand sort of the fundamental aspects of those cultures and what we can learn about them. Okay, so what is culture? Okay, culture is a system of knowledge, beliefs, patterns of behavior, artifacts being stuff that people use, right, our material culture, and institutions that are, institutions being like education, government, those kinds of things, right? We talked a little bit about that. That they are learned, shared, contested by a group of people, right? So we learn about them, we share that information with other people, and then we contest those things within our culture as we change our values, change our ideals, and different cultures, again, do this at different rates depending on various cultural influences. Culture also has a shared group of norms being sort of the laws of the land, as it were. Values, symbols, mental maps of reality, we'll get into that. We also have material objects and systems of power, and these things help us to understand sort of how culture functions, right? And these are sort of included in these different systems of power when we look at things like media, right? Media being an overwhelming word and encapsulation of how we share information, right? Media can be, obviously the news, it's books, it's papers, it's comics, it's anything that you use to gain new information. That's a form of media. Education, our economic system, religion, and politics, right? These are all ways that we gather information, gather ideas, create norms and patterns of behavior given any circumstance that we might be in. And this is how cultures view the world, right? What is right? What is wrong? It's how we perceive things. It's how the world is shaped around us. It's how we reinforce those things and negotiate those things, right? And by negotiation, I'm talking about how we might say, well, this is, we like what we're doing here, but we'd like to change this. Or we don't like what we're doing here, and we'd like to change this, right? So it can be shaped by a large group of people, right, obviously, or a small group. And it depends on all these things, right? The diversity of religion, sexual orientation, race, gender, class, ethnic identity, all of these things can be shaped by cultural behaviors, right? The things that we find important, whether or not it's if we're going to talk about gender, which we will periodically through the course, thinking about how ideology fits, whether or not we're going to look at religious ideology around gender, or, sort of those different concepts. So we're looking at how people are going to deal with those subjects. Excuse me. It's how it defines who we are, right? Culture is literally our identity, okay? And the thing about culture is that we live in a lot of different cultures, right? We actually define ourselves through multiple cultures. It's not just one, right? We might define ourselves as Americans, but we don't always share everything that other Americans have, right? We didn't grow up in that part of the country. We might not speak the same. So we might have some overall identity that matches with us, but then we might have things like Colorado culture, right? What is unique to Colorado, and so on and so forth. And we'll talk about how each of these things sort of define us in different ways to create more and more subcultures and identity around our culture. So when we think about culture, right, it's something that is learned, something that is taught, something that can change, right? And again, depending on the size and scope of that culture, like the United States, we have a very diverse culture and it is constantly changing. If we were to go to a smaller culture that doesn't have as many outside influences, that change is going to take place at a different rate. It's how we define ourselves, right? How you dress yourself, your language, and that dialect of language that you speak, right? We have different dialects in the United States of language. Not everyone speaks the same. And we have different words for different meanings. Our transportation, right? Transportation is a part of our culture. How do we do it? Do we look at just cars, or do we travel by bicycle? Do we walk? And do we travel by horseback? Transportation has a huge influence on our culture. It's our music, television, movies, our religions. All of those things help define what our culture is and how we should behave in that culture. And those things can change throughout your lifetime, right? Depending on the things that have particular value in your life, you might adapt to different ideas, right? Different thought patterns. And depending on your culture and how open it is to those changes can depend on how you're taught whether or not you can change those things, right? Which is, I think, a very interesting concept, Again, in the United States, we are taught that we can make ourselves who we want to be, right? We have freedom of speech. We have freedom of thought, right? That allows a lot of wiggle room to make those sort of decisions, right? If you live in a very monolithic culture with strict ideas about how you should behave and what things you are open to, then those sort of levels of change might not be as welcome. And so, why is that the case? So we're going to try and, kind of deal with some of those issues. As we grow up, we go through this process, and this is throughout our entire lives, we go through this process of enculturation, right? And enculturation is the steady influx of information from all the different sources in our lives, right? So it's our family, it's schools, it's TV, radio, all of those things. And so what we try and understand about enculturation is how does it impact us, right? This is just the stuff that we observe every day, and try and understand those things, right? And it builds up our character, it builds up the things that we find valuable in our lives, the important things, our sense of right and wrong, right? All of those things are learned through this process of enculturation. And so what we'll do is we'll talk a little bit about the different aspects that are usually pretty fundamental in that process of enculturation. So first off, we're going to look at family, right? Family, obviously, right? You're going to grow and learn a lot from your family as you're developing. It's the first place that you're going to learn language, right? Language defines your reality. So whatever language that your family speaks is likely going to be the foundation for your sort of worldly outlook, right? At least initially. So we learn about the fundamentals of what is right, wrong, right? Don't hit your sister, right? Um, don't play with fire. Be nice to others. How do you eat at a table, right? Does your family use forks and knives? Do they use chopsticks? Do they eat with their hands? What are the tools that are available within your family to teach you the behavior of eating? Right? We don't usually think about that, right? We don't usually think about sort of like the fundamental things that we take for granted, right? Like, having dinner. But dinner is fundamental to culture, right? And our behavior around that helps to establish sort of these aspects of identity around us. So we start at a very early age with family. A lot of our fundamental aspects of culture, the things that we find important, are developed early on from there. Then we have school, education, right? In our country, it's mandatory that you go to high school, right? And if you don't go to high school, if you drop out, it's hard to get a job, right? But we have a system in place where students or children go to learn the basic things about life, right? We're no longer an agrarian society where a lot of the stuff you would learn at home, doing your life's work, you would learn your parents' occupations from them. Now, right, everyone goes to school, they all learn the same things, they learn their language skills, they learn math, they learn all the aspects that our culture deems to be important, right? And that's any educational system, is that whatever that culture says, hey, this is the important things that you need to know about your culture, right? So it's about your history, it's about your civics, right? Most kids have taken a civics course. What are the three aspects of the federal government, right? So we learn those things from school. And we also learn behavior at school, right? You're around a lot of other kids. You're around a lot of adults that aren't your parents. And you have to learn rules of behavior around those people, right? Depending on your interactions with them, right? You might develop your first friends at school, your first enemies at school, your first mentors outside of your parents, right? Maybe you have a favorite teacher or a teacher you loathe, right? All of those things, we learn how to deal with those complicated issues. And school is usually one of those places where we do that, right? It's not just about the book learning, but it's about behavioral learning. Then we have religion, right? Religion is oftentimes one of those things that allows us to establish values within a system or within a culture, right? And values are sort of the fundamental things within our societies that determine what is right and wrong. Now, in this country, if we look at the United States, it's certainly focused around, Christianity. And a lot of the values that are in this country are related to those Christian beliefs and Christian practices. Now, you might be an atheist, you might be Muslim, you might be agnostic or Buddhist or whatever, but you still learn a lot of the cultural values, what we consider to be right and wrong. Even if you aren't a part of that religion, those sort of rules and ideas filter into areas outside of religious practice. So a lot of the things that we value as a culture today, even if we don't recognize ourselves as being religious practitioners of whatever religion, we're still learning those rules from the outside, right? From those religious ideologies and values. So, like education, religion oftentimes starts at an early age, and they can look different in different ways. Different ways of behavior, right? You go to church, we'll be talking about norms here in a few minutes, but you go to church and you're going to behave differently in church than you would in a school, right? Or at home or at your grandmother's house, right? There's different ways that we learn how to behave in different circumstances, and we learn about the value of the things that we are learning can be different, right? Religion oftentimes has sort of an absoluteness to it of grand importance. And if we look at those things and we see that, this is really important, that we have to learn and we have to behave like, that can have a big impact on your entire life and the values that you believe in and will work towards. So religion is huge when it comes to sort of that development. We talked a little bit about friends. Friends are one of those ways that we learn about our culture in a number of different ways, right? We talked a little bit how you might make friends at school, and it becomes much more complicated than that. Friends are the first time that you actually get to test those sort of cultural behaviors, right? You find out what is right and wrong and what kind of limits you might be able to push, right? So maybe in your group of friends, you can push boundaries, push ideas, challenge ideology without having to worry about consequence, right? Or at least to the same extent that you might if you were to test it in a school setting or a religious setting, right? And that's really important. That's why having friendships and stuff like that become really important, because oftentimes it's a testing ground, right? You can challenge certain things and have safety in those people without necessarily having to worry about being challenged in school or in church or by your family, right? And then they also bring different perspectives into your life. Say you grew up as a Lutheran and you meet a friend in school who is Muslim, right? Now they're bringing in their perspective and teaching you about their religion, their ideas, and then you're doing the same thing to them. Your values, your norms, your behaviors, they're learning from you. And so you find this place where different ideas, different thought patterns can come together and work together and mesh themselves into something that is that can't be achieved, just in a school setting, just from education, just from religious studies. Then we have media, right? And media, certainly in our culture, has become very, very important. And media is that idea of being able to learn, again, outside of those normal settings. And when I talk about media, I'm not just talking about like television or the news, right? Oftentimes today when we hear people talking about the media, they're talking about news sources, CNN, Fox, that kind of stuff. But media in itself is just a means of transferring information from one venue into another. So, television, you're watching something, radio, newspapers, books, comics, storytelling, right? When you're sitting around the campfire and you're telling stories about the Sasquatch or Sam Squanch if you're Canadian, that's where you learn that stuff, and that is a form of media, right? That's storytelling. So it's really all about how media influences you. Now, if we think about American culture, right, we're inundated with media. We're surrounded with media. It's on our phones. It's on our laptops. It's, you go home and you see newspapers or magazines. It's the mail. It's, watching, again, the news, right? It's all of these different things, and it has an influence on you. Now, what if you grew up in a community that doesn't have that doesn't have those outside sources, sort of reaching out for your attention, right? And there's lots of communities around the world that still do this, that don't have the same level of access to media that most Americans do. And this can certainly influence those cultures, right? We're bombarded with all of these different ideas and different concepts, and that's what allows Americans to experience rapid culture change, because we're being exposed to all of these different things on a regular basis. One of the things you might consider looking at would be like an agrarian community that doesn't have, maybe they don't have access to electricity. There are lots of communities around the world that still live without electricity. If they don't have electricity, they're not going to have cell phones. They're not going to typically not going to have cell phones, not going to have access to all of the types of media that we are used to. Because of that, right, their access to information is going to be different. And so how do we look at that, right? If we want to understand how information is passed on from one source to another, how do we see that, right? And then also time, right? If we think about the United States, we go back 100 years ago, we go back 50 years ago, we go back even 10 years ago, we can see how media has changed over time. 100 years ago, we really only started getting movies, right? We didn't have television yet. We had movies, but radio was becoming more popular, but it was like 1 in every 10 households, if that. Maybe even greater, that actually had a radio in their house, or did they have access to it? Most people got their information from newspapers, if they got information at all. And so, it becomes very different when you look at how that media gets shared, right? So that's one of the things that we try to understand. What are those influences? What are the things that are changing us? So things that define us. Oftentimes we look at sort of the big things, right? We look at language. Language is extremely important to understand about a culture. There are laws. What are the things that are defined that are right and wrong, right? And those can oftentimes be at conflict. Geographical location. Where were you born? Where do you live? Geographical location can have a huge impact on how you develop, right? Both physically, sort of the physical access to food and resources, to clean air or dirty water, right? Those can have a big impact on your behavior, on your health, right? And those are things that need to be considered. Again, media, the things that we consume, and then sort of cultural ideals, right? If we look at the United States, we think about freedom, opportunity, the concept of the American dream. And I'm always fascinated by the American dream because it is experienced differently by different people, right? You ask sort of any modern American what they think of the American dream, and they're like, there's aspects of truth to it, right? Can everyone accomplish the things that they want to do? And you might get some resistance. You go to some other country around the world, one that might be in a state of poverty, and they hear about the American dream, and it's beyond their current means. They get excited about it. They're like, oh, I can live a better life, right? We oftentimes take it for granted. right? It's, oh, yeah, well, American dream, whatever, right? We all sort of grew up this way, and you hear it all the time, you know, but someone else might experience it in a very different way. And so those cultural ideals that happen, we'll talk about hegemonic forces later on as we talk about culture going out and coming back in and bringing people and ideas. We'll talk about that, and this sort of falls into that process of what does it mean to be American? Different Americans are going to see it a different way. People outside of the United States are going to see Americans in a completely different way than we might see ourselves, right? And that again goes back to sort of that theoretical truth and ground truth, right? Sort of that idealized identity and actual identity and this all comes down to perception, right? How do we see ourselves? How do other people see us? As I mentioned before, our culture defines what is right and wrong, okay? What is lawful and unlawful. And these do not necessarily have to be the same thing, right? This is where then culture can be contested, right? Culture is about creating norms and then conflicting with them. And we're gonna do an exercise here in a minute. Every culture can have a set of rules. Sometimes they can be narrow and they can be very specific with specific consequences, right? If they are followed or not followed. Or they can be broad. And, if you break those norms, there really isn't any specific consequence. So we try and define what those are. So what I want you guys to do is to take a moment and I want you to think about something that could be defined as lawful yet morally wrong, and then something that is considered unlawful and morally right. So take a couple of minutes, think about this, write something down, and then pause right now, and come back and I'll give you guys an example. Okay, pause. Okay, we're back. Okay, so we'll take a huge topic right now, right? We'll talk about abortion. So, abortion is one of those subjects that, depending on who you are, what part of culture you're coming from, it actually fits both of these categories, right? You might live in a state in which it is lawful for abortion to take place. And yet morally, people think that it is wrong to do so, right? Colorado is one of those states where, you can have an abortion. Not everyone agrees that it should be. You can then look at, say, another state like Texas, right, in which it is unlawful to have an abortion, or at least past a certain date. And I think they're trying to pass that. Oh, they've been trying to pass it for years. It's unlawful to have an abortion. But some people believe it is morally right to have that access, to have that control over one's own body, right? So when we think about what might be lawful yet morally wrong, or unlawful but morally right, we're really again talking about perception, different people's ideas, and that they might coexist and mingle together, and that can create those sort of ideas of conflict. So when we look at politics, right, we're constantly inundated with politics. That's when we oftentimes see this taking place, right? What is morally right? What is morally wrong? And how do we make it lawful or unlawful? All depending on sort of your point of view, right? If we're talking about gun laws, right? Well, if you're a trained hunter, right, you've been around guns your entire life and you understand the impact that they have, but it's a part of your culture, then you might want the right to be able to own those guns. If you live in a culture in which, or a community that has seen all kinds of gun violence and has seen all this stuff take place, the pain and the agony of that violence, then you would say that, you know, you don't want those guns to be there, right? But now we're looking at two different aspects of our culture, two different subcultures coming into conflict with each other. And they're coming at it usually from different perspectives, right? And those perspectives are oftentimes loaded with different attributes, right? We can look at race, we can look at gender, we can look at sexuality, religion, right? All of these things will come in and have an impact on those different perceptions of what is right and what is wrong. And that's where we come into those sort of moral conflicts. And again, one of the things that as anthropologists, we all recognize that we have bias, but our objective is to look at those things and try and eliminate that bias and get down to the understanding of, like, why is this happening? You know, can we learn more about it? So, yeah, kind of a big deal. Culture can be defined by billions of people. If you're American, you fit into the 320 some odd million people that claim to be American, and it's like, you know, I have this shared history, shared culture. But then when we break it down, we don't all see the same thing, right? We don't all live in the same place. We talked a little bit about this. So what happens when you live in Colorado, right? What happens when you live in Fort Collins or Denver? You know, you are a student at a university, right? That university is a different culture, right? You have different right and wrong behaviors that you have to understand what you're supposed to do, right? How do you sit in a classroom? That's a cultural behavior, right? And you only do that in that place, in that moment in time when you're sitting in that classroom. So all of these things have different cultural imperatives, right? What does it mean to be a part of this culture, this subculture? And it also focuses again on those imperatives, but it also eliminates things, right? So let's say you live in Fort Collins and, you know, you're really focused on your immediate environment. Do you really care who the mayor of Durango is? Right? Probably not, right? Because it doesn't really have a huge impact on your daily business, right? Different town, different part of the state, different geography. And you might visit there, but, you know, it's not something that you deal with a lot of, right? You're more focused right here. You might want to know a little bit about what's going on, but not that much. And then we can go even broader, right? Who's the governor of Idaho, right? Or the mayor of Boise? That's even less important to you as an individual because you are more focused on, again, your immediate surroundings, right? So there are these connections to other places and other people, but they aren't as important as more of the localized sort of culture. So we look at sort of that national stage. What is it that makes Americans Americans? What makes us Coloradans versus Floridians, right? What's the difference? So if we think about state and national ideas, right? If we think about, again, language, right? Well, the majority of Americans speak English. Is it all the same? No, it's not. We have Midwestern, we have New York accents, we have New Jersey accents, we have Floridian, we have that California California beach, Malibu, Long Beach sort of accents of how people talk, the things that they find important, the words that they use to define the things that are important, right? If we think about, again, the Front Range, right? I might say as someone who grew up in Colorado and talking about the Front Range or the Western Slope, right? I'm talking about not only geographical locations, but also cultural locations, right? When we talk about the Front Range, it's usually talking about everything from Fort Collins down to Colorado Springs and Pueblo, and then that's about it. That's that cultural corridor, and it's a mix of, a lot of liberalism in the north from Denver to Fort Collins, and then conservative from Colorado Springs to Pueblo. But we understand that when we just use that term, Front Range, and then we talk about the Western Slope, right? Same sort of concept, same sort of ideas. But if I were to say that to someone who was living in Wisconsin, and I was talking about the Front Range, they might have no idea what I'm talking about because it isn't relative to them, and it doesn't matter. So, language becomes important in how we identify things, how we recognize those things. We look at laws, right? Laws can be different from state to state. Again, going back to our abortion example. But we might look at other things, right? Weed, right? If we go back in time, weed was legal in the United States, and then it was made illegal. Hemp used to be a huge crop that we grew in the United States because hemp is one of those plants that you can get a lot of different types of use out of, not only for the THC and stuff, but we're talking about the fibers for making ropes and other textiles, and the seeds can be used to eat. So there's a whole bunch of uses for it. So and then we legalized it, and that had to change how we did things. We had to look for other answers. So laws, right? Laws can be different on a national level. Geographical locations, beach culture versus mountain culture, right? And it can be different, again, from things like Florida beaches to California beaches, right? What are the differences? A Florida beach compared to Lake Superior and the beaches they have there. Location becomes really important because that also influences things like food, right? What kinds of food do you have available? If you were living in Colorado 50 years ago, your access to things like lobster, live lobster for that matter, was pretty slim, right? But now you can go to the store, you can go to restaurants, and you can get live lobster, because we can now transport those things in. We didn't have access to it before, right? So our geographical location oftentimes sort of creates patterns of eating, patterns of health, right? What do we have, again, access to? A lot of people come to Colorado because they love the mountain culture. We have a lot of athletes that move to Colorado because of the altitude and our training facilities, right? If you train at a higher altitude, you can get stronger and better, and when you go to lower altitudes, then that oxygen becomes even more important, right? So that's one of the reasons why people might come here to do those kinds of things. Amongst many, Colorado is great. Media, both local and national media, can be different. And then you throw in things like, the internet and regular old television. newspapers, right? All of these things can have different impacts on you. Today, we live in a much larger globalized world, right? So national and international news is oftentimes leading the way, right? We're hearing about stuff that's happening halfway around the world. And localized news is diminishing as people are becoming more and more concerned about what's happening elsewhere. So how we look at news and how we consume that news and where we find our focus and important, how we look at the world in different importance ways, right? This becomes really one of those processes in which we understand the changing values of a culture, right? When we look at outside the world around us and the things that are changing out there and how it's going to impact us, right? And we learn about those things from, again, the media. And then again, we have also like cultural ideals, right? If we're thinking about Colorado, right, we oftentimes look at mountain sports, skiing, environmental issues, concepts of nativism, right, which is always interesting for me because every once in a while you'll see like a truck or a car driving around and it's got like the Colorado license plate with a sticker, sticker of the plate and it says native on it, saying I am from here, this is who I am, this is part of my identity, I identify as Coloradan, right? And that takes a very interesting look at what they find to be important, not only identifying as local, but it also says something about people that aren't local, right? Maybe they don't like people from other states moving in and living amongst the natives, right? Outdoor activities, talked about that. Weed, right? Colorado, and there's as many, weed shops as there are Starbucks, right? Which is fundamentally amazing that is actually something that we do or have, right? But that's a cultural change. That's something that's changed drastically over the last 10 years. Then we come down to things like city culture, right? What is it like to live in Fort Collins or Denver? What is it about localized language? Is there a change in localized language? Our geographical location, what are the local laws? And then what are the cultural ideals of, say, Fort Collins? What are the things that are important here, right? If you live in a college town, what kind of an impact does that college town have on local commerce, right? Local economics. Who are the people that are living in college towns, right? So if we look at Fort Collins, Fort Collins used to be a college town, right? But it's also grown. It's become industrious and commercial, and there's a lot of research that happens here, and it's grown from just being a college town to something more. But those college towns have a tendency to attract certain people. And it's the same way if you live in an agrarian town or if you live in an industrial town, where the focus of those communities become imperative to that community, right? And it reinforces those behaviors and those goals. So when we look at city level sort of cultural practices, we can look at all these different cities and see that they reinforce certain types of behavior and attract certain types of people. So we look at culture as a shared and contested aspect of our lives, right? So these are a couple of things that we could look at, which are going to be those contested ideas. So if we look at like religion, right? Religion is often one of those things, especially in this country right now, which is being hotly contested. Religious ideology, religious practices, what religion you should believe in, right? And when you are like a monoculture where you might only have that religion, you might not see that contested. But we don't live there. We live where we've got lots of different religions influencing us and competing for the individual's attention, right? And then people can go out and seek those different religions, right? They might start out as Christian and then turn Muslim, or they might be Muslim and become Christian, or they might be atheist and become Buddhist, right? There's all these different options. So there's obviously a lot of things can be contested. Abortion, which we discussed, guns, again, hotly contested. Things like weed, drugs, that kind of stuff. The environment, how we should be able to access our environment, use our environment as a resource, as a part of our identity. You know, if we're cutting trees down, you know, is that going to deplete our landscape? Is it going to deplete our resources? And of course, politics, right? So these are definitely some things that are hotly contested within our own culture. One of the things that we always have to recognize too is that culture is never static. Okay, and what does that mean? Culture is always changing, and it just depends on the rate of change, depending on the size of culture, right? If we look at American culture, it's big, right? We've got lots of people, lots of different influences. People are traveling from all over the world to come live and work here, and they are bringing their knowledge and their beliefs and their practices, and it has a huge influence. And so we see a lot of cultural change taking place on a pretty rapid scale. Now, if I were to go to, say, the middle of the Amazon, and I were to find a group of Yanomamo who were living there and had been living in that same area for the last 10,000 years, right? Their culture will have changed over time, but it might not have changed much, right? They might have slightly new influences, slight new things of change, but change usually comes from the outside, right? And if you're an isolated community, you're not going to see a lot of that change. So that cultural change might take place over a longer period. Okay, we're going to end it there, and we'll come back and talk about the next section of cultural anthropology and culture. We'll see you in a few.